Hey everyone, Coach Micah here, and welcome back to the channel. In last week's video, I showed you how the negative would respond to the affirmative case, given the cases that I presented in videos prior, and if you haven't watched it, go ahead and do it right now. But now it is time for the affirmative to come back and regain their honor, because hopefully the negative has come and given some pretty strong argumentation as to why the affirmative should lose. And so the affirmative really needs to set the tone for the rest of the debate, because the next time they'll be able to speak, they will have to address a full rebuttal given by the negative in 6 minutes that goes over the entire round, plus some voting issues, and the affirmative will only have 3 minutes to address all of it and persuade the judge to win the round. And so this is really the turning point. This is the most important speech, in my opinion, the affirmative can give, because if they fail at this 4 minutes, if they fail to prepare for their last speech, it's pretty much game over, because time is really valuable in Lincoln Douglas. It impacts the words that you use, it impacts your delivery, and of course it impacts your ability to persuade the judge. So in this video, we are going to be going over the affirmative responses to the negative, and then I want to show you some statistics of how, at least with timing, it would work for the affirmative to give you kind of a heads up on what you should expect as you go into the round. Now, the numbers won't be exact because every round is different, but it's going to give you a good average. Towards the end of the video, we are going to briefly discuss the negative rebuttal and the second affirmative rebuttal, the 6-minute speech and 3-minute speech. We're not going to talk about how we would respond or carry the argumentation through, but I just want to show you the timing, or what it would look like as you strategize for giving a really good ending speech to end the round on a high note, on an impactful note. We'll save the content for a future video, because as the season quickly approaches, we need to discuss other things, because I want to help prepare you well for the season. So this is going to be the last video specifically for this video series. Remember, we started with analyzing the affirmative, and we're going to end with showing you how you are going to end the round well in terms of statistics, because I really like statistics. But without any further ado, let's get straight into it. How will the affirmative come back to rebut the negative? Now, I chose this image because I am a sports fanatic, and I wanted to really talk about how the affirmative can come back. And for a little bit of context, this is a picture of the New England Patriots scoring a touchdown in the Super Bowl against the Atlanta Falcons. At one point in time, the Patriots were losing 28-3. A nearly impossible score to beat given the low amount of time remaining in the game, but of course they were able to do so in one of the craziest comebacks of NFL history, especially because it was the championship round. And to me, every LD round is like a championship round. We should be preparing for it, and we should be executing to our highest ability possible, and we need to understand that the game ain't over until it's over. The debate round is not over till it's over. The negative should hopefully give you a challenge, coming up with their own constructive and rebuttal, but you, of course, are going to have 4 minutes to make sure everything gets on track and, of course, persuade the judge to prepare you for the upcoming round. So the goal of this speech, right, is to wrap up some loose ends, to refute the negative, and of course to lay the groundwork for our 3-minute speech. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to finish the analysis debate. Remember, if you watched last week's video, you'll know that there was a resolutional analysis debate based on the majority claim versus the context of the resolution. We'll see how that looks in this video. We also have the values debate. The negative brought up a value of human dignity as opposed to our value of stability. And so we need to address that as well. And we're going to figure out how we can persuade the judge through all of it today. Let's start with finalizing the definitions debate here. So we initially brought up a definition on the affirmative of diplomacy to say anything short of war or violence. Now, the negative came up and said, actually, that is not a good definition, because we cannot distinguish diplomacy from military intervention if it's any other war, if it's any other measure short of war or violence. Because in the negative's mind, military intervention does not equate to war or violence, because the military can be used in nonviolent ways, I guess. And so they say, well, we need a new definition of diplomacy, and that new definition is going to be maintaining relationships and conducting negotiations, basically. Again, if you want to read along, you can go to my Patreon page and go to that Excel file that was one of my most recent posts, and you can read some of what the responses would be there. And of course, I think a good strategy is to just agree. Say, yeah, Judge, I can totally agree to the idea that diplomacy is maintaining relations and conducting negotiations. That's actually not going to harm us at all. In fact, it's the idea of negotiating that is going to make our case stronger. Now, we need to bring up an observation point, okay? Because in the negative speech, they really made it sound like the affirmative's just weak. You have a bunch of meek political leaders who they just sit around and they shake hands all day, and that's it. And any type of action, military, engaging in the military whatsoever, that is not diplomacy. So we're going to start off our speech with an observation point. And that observation point is the mighty negotiation. And here we're going to say, Judge, the negative is characterizing the affirmative as nothing more than a weak strategy that purely relies on hope of an agreement. But in reality, negotiation is a big deal. The stakes are high, and the might of a nation will set the tone of a meeting between world leaders. Diplomacy is much more powerful than my opponent realizes. So the opponent, the negative, in their last speech, the strategy was to belittle the AF, basically show that the affirmative is weak and powerless and diplomacy cannot get anything done, and that's where military intervention comes in. But we're saying actually diplomacy gets a lot more done than the negative thinks. So of course we have to go over the resolutional analysis. The negative showed that we need to actually talk about the conflict, because as the affirmative, we just said in the majority of the time. They said, well, no, we need a conflict because the resolution doesn't happen a majority of the time. We're going to agree to this idea, but we're going to clarify. We're going to say, well, yes, the context of the resolution is foreign policy. And foreign policy takes place 24/7, 365, right? It is constant. So the choice between whether we maintain relationships and negotiate versus invade some other country, that choice is always happening. Any country could choose to invade any country at any other time. That choice is possible, but we choose diplomacy a majority of the time. So we can agree that we need conflict, but Judge, that conflict happens so much of the time. So let's look at the majority and not the minority. So we're bringing this argumentation back to the majority, because in our minds, the biggest arguments, the biggest examples of military intervention are going to be one-offs. Israel, Ukraine. Out of 195 countries, only 2 of them are relevant for military intervention. That's a very low percentage of the resolution being false, which means a very high percentage of the resolution being true, right? So once we have gone through the resolution analysis point, we can go on to the value battle. So they talked about human dignity, because stability we can't guarantee that things will be stable. So we have 2 responses here. The first one is nothing guaranteed. Nothing is ever guaranteed, ever. But that does not mean we should therefore just stop trying to do that strategy. It's not guaranteed that you're going to win the debate round, so you just quit? Should you just not even sign up for a tournament because you're not guaranteed to win? Like, that logic doesn't make sense. So this is something, of course, we would hone and refine the response, but the idea of the first response is that nothing is guaranteed. But then we need to take over the value, because nothing is wrong with human dignity. Human dignity is great, and as the affirmative, you shouldn't have to disagree with that. So we're going to basically absolve it. It's going to be part of our theory. It's going to be part of our strategy. We're going to talk about that if we're discussing a moral government, which is what the negative said, if a moral government works to protect its people, shouldn't stability be the highest priority? Both of our values are important, Judge. But think of it this way. Whichever side creates the most stable environment will thereby default be upholding human dignity. So the goal here is actually to say, judge, whatever value you like, stability or human dignity, they're both equal. Like, they're both going to be upheld by the affirmative speech. It's not actually a threat by the negative to agree with their value. Both values are great. They're really important. If we want human dignity, things have to be stable. So we're just going to agree to them both. They're the same idea. We have the same priority. Which side of the resolution creates a better world for humans and for the stability, political relationships, and things like that? So just, yeah, judge, human dignity is great. We have the same priorities in today's debate round, so that should make the decision really easy. So now we have the dismantling of the negative constructive. If you remember from last week's video, the negative really existed in three main points. Both of their contentions were that three comparisons, right? A, B, and C. Their first was the idea that diplomacy cannot provide aid. Then they talked about how diplomacy is not guaranteed, right? Talks may fail. And then they brought up the point that you have to ignore terrorism because the only way to deal with terrorism is with the military. And diplomacy can't obviously be the military, so therefore you have to ignore terrorism, which is a very emotional argument. No one wants to ignore terrorism. So how would the affirmative respond? Well, let's start with no aid. Aid diplomacy. The response to the idea of no aid is that a lot of the aid actually happens because of diplomacy, because most aid is economical. Yes, sometimes aid can be provided by the military, but that actually doesn't happen that often. Most of the time it's negotiating between nations to figure out how we can provide for you via the economy. Funding. A lot of funding happens because of diplomacy. So this point falls. They also talked about how talks may fail, right? And our response to this is of constant goal. The idea here is that diplomacy may not happen in the first shot, sure. But it's the idea of the cannot guarantee logic, right? Just because something might not happen right away doesn't mean we give it up. You gotta continue at it, right? Sometimes nations won't reach deals or the negotiations will be rough for a while, but you have to keep going at it. And if you're really good at diplomacy, you're going to be able to come up with some sort of a deal. You're going to be able to de-escalate something. So it's a constant goal. Yeah, talks may fail, but military intervention also may fail. Does that mean it's therefore less effective, right? That's the logic here. And then must ignore terrorism. Well, our response to that is de-escalation. A key tool of diplomacy is de-escalation. We avoid terror threats before they even happen because, and this is where we want to reference the definition. Judge, my opponent agreed to the definition of diplomacy and even talked about how it should be negotiations. Well, nations negotiate with terrorists all the time. It's not in the negotiations of you give me this, I'll give you that. It's if you attack me, I will blow you up. Mutually assured destruction is not military intervention. Mutually assured destruction is a form of negotiation. If you do this, then I will respond like this. And that usually deters people from acting. It de-escalates by getting people to calm down, because if they don't, they will be attacked, right? So diplomacy can fight terrorism because you are de-escalating their terror. Now that we've talked about it, we can, again, apply these same arguments to the subpoints in their second contention, because they talked about how, well, military intervention is a vessel for aid. It is also a form of self-defense and it fights terrorism. And of course, our response is aid diplomacy. Yes, you can provide aid through the military, but the majority, back to the resolutional analysis, in the majority of instances, diplomacy is responsible for the aid provided. You have self-defense. In this case, our response is aggression is rare. In the majority of countries, de-escalation and deterrence are all that is needed. Only a couple examples of the active militaries in our current world exist out of the 192 countries or 195 countries, right? And it's basically Israel and Ukraine and Russia and maybe the United States too. But just Israel and Ukraine for the most part, which means in the majority of instances, countries aren't fighting. They're not using military intervention. They're using diplomacy, and they're stable, and they're upholding their relationship with their allies, and they are keeping enemies at bay. So self-defense is only necessary in rare instances. Aggression is very rare, thanks to diplomacy and thanks to that stability. And of course, the idea of fighting terrorism are, again, responses deterring terror. Now, you might be tempted to do cross responses. So under both subpoints, you would respond to both of them at the same time. For organizational sake, don't do that. Just give the same tag once you reach that argument one more time. So we respond A, B, and C, and then we once again respond A, B, and C in that second contention. No cross applications. No cross apply this, cross apply that. That is a one-way ticket to confuse city, and the judge will not know what's going on. So just, the cool thing is, if you've already given an argument, you don't have to explain the argument again. You could just tag my response as XYZ and then move on, because your judge will already know what you're trying to say there. Now we have to defend our affirmative position. So we had two arguments in our first case, right? We had the ping pong diplomacy was to show that we rekindled a relationship with China amidst a Cold War, and that was good for us. And of course, that military intervention was tried in Vietnam, and it completely failed. They had several responses to these applications. Under ping pong diplomacy, they had two. They said that, well, we're always in conflict with China. And then they said military intervention is actually what prevented war from breaking out, not diplomacy. So our responses are as follows. Always in conflict? Well, no active conflict. Yeah, we're not like extremely friendly, like they're not, our best friend, but China is a key economic partner. They're a trading partner with the United States. We both rely on each other heavily for our economies, which makes fighting or war very unlikely because of how much we rely on each other. So we're very stable. We're not like best buddies. We sure have a rocky relationship, sure, but we don't have to worry about China like blowing up the United States. Now, some people are worried about that, but in the terms of what we're arguing right now, that argument is not warranted. That fear is not warranted. We're stable with China right now. We've been stable for many years, and our economies have grown based off of our trade between them, right? And then they, again, talk about how military intervention prevented war. Our response is negotiation versus action. This is going to be a key point of this particular debate. There is a difference between acting, a military invading, intervening, a verb, right, to intervene, and threatening intervention. Your threats are not an action. You can threaten something and never do the thing. So really, the debate round, given the definitions that we have agreed to of negotiations versus action, right, then any type of negotiation, which can be threats, negotiations can include threats, is therefore diplomacy in foreign policy because it's part of the negotiation. Military intervention, or mutually assured destruction, is what prevented any war. No country was willing to act against another country because they understood the risks and the threats of mutually assured destruction. So it was diplomacy that stopped the Cold War. It was the United States diplomacy with China that basically scared Russia into not acting, right? We kind of teamed up with China against Russia and threatened them to, you better not attack us or else. So really, diplomacy, because it's so mighty and powerful, it's what prevented war, not military intervention. And then, of course, we talked about Vietnam. Their first response was that diplomacy didn't work. And then their second response was that military interventions are still effective. They just chose the wrong one. Our response to the diplomacy didn't work is going to be of different tactics, right? And it's the idea that, well, my opponent said that military intervention could still be effective. I'm going to say the same thing here. Diplomacy could still have been effective if you had done it differently, right? Now, as opposed to military intervention would have still been effective, our response to that is that it's an intervention mindset. And remember, the negative was saying, well, this is a carbon copy of a different war. Like, they didn't change anything. They should have re-strategized, and they should have just done military intervention the right way. Our response is to say that when you are in the mindset of intervening with your military, you're going to fall into a lot of the same mistakes that you made. Like countries that are constantly utilizing their military, they're going to fall, they're going to make the same mistakes. You're going to see things, they're going to try to apply the same strategies differently, which is why we need to have a mindset of diplomacy. We need to have a mindset of negotiation. So that's how we respond to the arguments there. Now, that's basically the end of where we would basically end there, right? But here's the bird's eye view of what this speech would look like. So you have available to you 4 minutes, and you need at least 10 seconds to enter. Now, I should say at most 10 seconds. You don't need to start off this 4-minute speech with a monologue about XYZ. Just start it maybe with one quote. It should be no longer than 10 seconds, okay? If you look back at all of the arguments we talked about, from the definition through analysis, all the way to the response of the contention and application, there are 15 arguments, 15 tags, if you are tagging everything, which you should be, which leaves you a 14 seconds per response time. So basically 10-second refutation, but with the added benefit of 4 extra seconds. So you should be able to respond to all of these arguments in 14 seconds per argument. That will give you about 3 minutes. If you start with 10 seconds, you respond to all 15 arguments in 14 seconds or less, you'll have about 3 minutes and 40 seconds of time that has transpired, which leaves you 20 seconds to end the speech on a high note. Give some sort of impactful closing, finishing statement to really set you up for the last affirmative speech, right? Now, of course, the negative is going to come in, and they have some things to tie up, but they have a little bit more time, right? They have 6 minutes available to them, and they also should start their speech after about 10 seconds. Just quick opener, some sort of hook, does not need to be long at all. Then you have to address the 15 tagged arguments. You have about 14 seconds of response time, and the reason you have the same amount of time is because you need about 2 minutes to not to cross-examine, excuse me. You have 2 minutes to bring up voting issues, and they need to be good ones, because voting issues are how you convince the judge that you've won. The judge has been persuaded by a lot of different things by both speakers, so these voting issues really bring it down and tie those persuasive arguments with a neat little bow for them. So you should be spending the most amount of time on them. And of course, that'll also leave you with 20 seconds for an impactful speech. Once you've provided your last voting issue, you can go into your 20-second monologue to end. Now, 2 minutes is a lot of time. You can absolutely bring up multiple voting issues in 2 minutes. And the more you practice 10-second refutation, which is the subject of another video, 14 seconds would be absolutely amazing. It's a pretty good amount of time. It doesn't seem impossible. It's very possible, even for the 3-minute speech, right? Because yes, you may have 3 minutes to end the round. You need at least 1 minute to have voting issues. And if you have 3 voting issues, that's 20 seconds per voting issue. You should have summarized 5 or less. Let's say you went with 5 arguments. If you picked out 5 key issues, before you even get to a minute of voting issues, you have 18 seconds to respond to each argument. You also have the 10 seconds that you need to start the speech off strong, and of course the 20 seconds for ending. So if you have your 3 minutes minus 30 seconds, that's 2.5 minutes. Minus a minute for voting issues, that's 1.5 minutes. And so in 1 minute and 30 seconds, you can absolutely address 5 key arguments. That's more than enough time. And if you know how to respond to things well and briefly and, of course, impactfully. But, of course, this is just a rough estimate of what you should be expecting per round. Hopefully, you have less argumentation to deal with because in your 4-minute speech, right, you should have addressed everything. Your goal is to set up your 3-minute speech. Being an affirmative can be daunting, especially if you are a novice or you're someone who's less experienced and the negative is someone who is more experienced. Going up against 13 minutes of negative speaking with just 7 minutes of affirmative speaking can be tough. But as I showed you with that time allotment strategy, it's possible. And if you are able to utilize your skills as a debater, it is not only possible, it's the goal. You should be able to end every speech with just 20 seconds of pure impact and persuasion, starting them off with 10 seconds, right? If you want to be good at debate, you're going to be utilizing every single second. So, in future videos, we're going to be talking about, of course, how to do all of this. We'll do different drills and practices. I write up different ways to show you how 10-second refutation works, the different types of refutation, cross-examination, etc. We have a whole host of things to get into as the season goes, and so we're going to start our new video series soon, hopefully next week. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like and of course subscribe. I want to be able to continue creating content for you. If you have suggestions on what future videos should be or different ways that I can help you out, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. You could also email me at coachmicahdiaz@gmail.com. Thank you so much for watching this video, and thanks for spending the summer with me every Monday morning as we analyze the beginning of the STOA LD season with this resolution. I hope to have series like this as we get into the future resolutions and of course for many years to come. But until that happens, continue watching, go back and rewatch the old videos, get yourself ready, get yourself in the mindset to start off this next season with these arguments in hand. I'm giving you a lot of arguments that you'll probably see in actual tournaments, so make sure you keep a close eye on those. And of course, check out my Patreon because I will have resources posted there as well. I hope you guys have a wonderful week or weekend. Until then, see you later.